Hi there. This video lecture presentation is going to look at different forms of culture, including high culture, mass culture, folk culture, and popular culture. We're also going to look at the origins of cultural studies and a little bit about this term itself, culture. So I'm going to go to the screen share mode and have us looking at the PowerPoint slides. So we begin with this concept of culture, recognizing, as the Marxist literary critic Raymond Williams says, that culture is one of the two or three most complicated words in the English language. And the reason that it's such a complicated word is that its definition, its meaning, has evolved and changed historically over the centuries. So initially, the first definition of culture was what Williams refers to as an ideal definition of culture in terms of a process of intellectual, spiritual, and aesthetic development. So culture was defined in terms of a process of development. And then secondly, after that, a social definition of culture emerged, more kind of connected with like anthropology, which described a particular way of life, whether of a group of people, a period, or humanity in general. And then most recently, a documentary definition of culture has come about to describe the works and practices of intellectual and artistic activity, like the artifacts and objects that are produced. So let's take a look at each of these definitions of culture in a little bit more depth. The ideal definition of culture, as I said, is the oldest definition of culture to emerge. Williams traces it all the way back to the 15th century to describe a process of growth or cultivation. In other words, to tend or cultivate something like one would do in agriculture. So the metaphors of culture as a process of cultivation were closely connected with people whose predominant mode of existence was agricultural. So, like tending to crops or animals. This definition came to then be eventually extended to human development, so that human minds and the human spirit might be cultivated, might be uplifted, might be subject to a process of growth or cultivation through art, philosophy, literature, music, theater, and so forth. So basically, in this definition, culture is the stuff that helps us grow, that makes us into smarter, more enlightened people, with a greater appreciation for beauty and the finer things in life. This becomes kind of like the basis for a really like a hierarchical notion of high culture as opposed to low culture. So this ideal definition of culture has the seeds of like elitism, in terms of only the greatest forms of art, philosophy, literature, and so forth are considered culture. Only the stuff that helps us grow and enlightens us, that responds to our need for cultivation, only that stuff is defined as culture according to this definition, and everything else is excluded. So this, becomes basically a part of defining culture in a way that is the province of the upper classes and an educated elite. To be cultured basically was a synonym for being civilized, and culture and civilization kind of came to be synonyms for one another. So a bit later, we have a more neutral or a more anthropological definition of culture, which begins to emerge. And here, culture is a word that begins to describe just a way of life with all kinds of meanings and values attached, and not just in art and educational activities, but in ordinary behavior and institutions in more commonplace settings. So this definition of culture is neutral with respect to the, questions of quality or whether something makes us grow into better people. This is a more non-elitist definition in which culture is something shared by all the members of the group, and it's not necessarily about, just the best works of art or music or so forth. So here it's a more like definition that anthropologists would use of culture that's connected with language, religion, rituals, and symbols, the sort of stuff of everyday life, the stuff of practice that is commonly shared by a group of people. The final definition of culture that Williams, excavates in his historical examination of the concept is a documentary definition of culture. And here, culture is defined as in terms of the products, like the artifacts, the objects that are created through intellectual and artistic work, in which thought and experience are recorded. So this is the kind of definition of culture that might be employed in museums, whereby particular objects or artifacts are used to represent the beliefs and values of a particular group of people, or in like a time capsule where we dig a hole in the ground and bury all of these objects and artifacts that are meant to represent what it was like to be alive in 2021 or 1951, or in a particular time and place, objects and artifacts that are meant to symbolize, to embody the values and meanings of a culture. So this is the last of these definitions to appear historically, but it's also one that is more, when we talk about culture today, it's the one that's most commonly invoked, where we talk about works of art, works of music, works of literature. This can overlap with an ideal definition in certain, kind of elitist contexts, where only certain objects or artifacts count as culture and the rest is dismissed as junk. But the documentary definition doesn't necessarily presuppose this kind of elitist hierarchy. It can also be applied to the artifacts and objects of popular culture, as we will see. So, having already introduced the complexity of this word culture and like the different layers of historical baggage that it has accumulated over the centuries, we now make things even more complicated by introducing different forms of culture: high culture, full culture, mass culture, and popular culture. And here we want to understand the ways in which these different forms of culture have evolved historically, how they've come to be defined in particular historical contexts. And we also want to understand that these forms of culture need to be defined in relationship to one another, and particularly in relationships of conflict and opposition. So, for example, that high culture historically has been defined by its opposition or its distance from the low culture of the masses, of so-called mass culture. Similarly, folk culture has been defined in opposition to or as an alternative to mass culture, in the sense that folk culture is supposed to be something that is more authentic, more grounded in tradition, more connected to community and less commercial. Popular culture, when we get around to that at the end of this video lecture, will be defined as kind of being incorporating elements of both folk culture and mass culture, and yet kind of being its own thing and separate from, or at least distinctive from both of those, and also as in opposition to high culture as the symbolic other of high culture. This is all a way of basically saying that none of these cultural forms have really straightforward definitions that you could like look up in a dictionary and get a definitive answer for. They are all defined in relationship to one another. They are historical definitions that have changed over time, that arose in a particular context. And they are, above all, definitions that have to be understood in relationship to one another. And in these relationships of opposition, they can only be understood in relation to one another. So let us begin with this concept of high culture. Sort of the high theorist of high culture is this guy, Matthew Arnold, who way back in 1869 said that, you know, culture was the best that had been thought and said. So in other words, he inherited this ideal definition of culture as the stuff that helps us grow, that enlightens us, and that cultivates us. And that definition of high culture has sort of persisted to this day. In a way that's linked with especially the upper classes, the wealthy and the highly educated. The concept that has been most recently used to describe this is cultural capital, from a French sociologist named Pierre Bourdieu, coined this term cultural capital to talk about the ways in which elites are able to reproduce their power and reproduce larger social inequalities by basically claiming that their tastes are superior, and that this is something that basically proves that they should be in charge. That taste and culture has this effect of reproducing social inequality, particularly class inequalities. High culture is something that is intended to be, you know, educational and enlightening, but not necessarily entertaining. You know, it's like the cultural equivalent of like spinach. Like it might not be like, you know, the thing that we would ordinarily choose to eat, but it's going to help us grow up to be bigger, stronger, more enlightened, usually members of the upper class. And not necessarily something that's going to be like, you know, a whole lot of fun to go to, though. The point that we're going to emphasize in the slides to come when we're talking about high culture is that the opposition between high culture and low culture or mass culture is socially constructed. It is relatively arbitrary in the sense that it's not about the inferiority or the superiority of a particular cultural form. It has more to do with like who is attending, what is the context, what is the social function of the cultural form. So we want to keep this in mind, that the opposition is socially constructed, and that different forms of culture as a result might, you know, be considered high culture in one time and, you know, mass culture in another. So we'll look at a few of examples of how different cultural forms have actually changed in terms of their status and prestige that's been attached to them. So Matthew Arnold, as I mentioned in the previous slide, is this guy who kind of formulates this idea of high culture, that it has to be, you know, the best that has been thought and said. In his book, Culture and Anarchy, he basically says that culture is what's needed to prevent disorder among the masses, so that if the masses are not properly cultured, they will form a mob, they will engage in sin. Elites like Matthew Arnold were certainly worried that they might, form, join labor movements and, rebel through strikes or riots. That the masses were a force to be feared if you were an elite like Matthew Arnold, if you were, a member of the upper classes and who really identified with the interests of the upper classes. You thought that the masses were something that needed to be controlled and contained. And his answer to this was through culture, through instilling the ideas that of the best that has been thought and said, and that this would operate as a kind of a buffer or a boundary to prevent social chaos. The masses were, the sort of the term that people like Matthew Arnold were so afraid of. This had been a term of contempt in much of conservative thought. The upper classes, in particular after the French Revolution, had come to fear popular uprisings. And then as urbanization and industrialization continued to grow further in the 19th century, it instilled even more fear in the upper classes, because you had masses of people, living in cities, working in factories. And so there was this real palpable fear of, rebellion on the part of the lower classes. So with the development of high culture as a kind of buffer against these lower classes, there was this whole language of contempt that was used to describe the majority population, the so-called masses, as being base or low. There's this kind of metaphor of a vertical, layered society with the masses at the bottom, and then the upper classes as being people, who have standing, right? So there's this whole kind of vertical, this metaphor for society, this vertical metaphor for social hierarchy. And the low are the people that are assumed to act in these kind of ignorant and irrational ways, like a mob. So the mass was a word that was used to describe, when we talk about like a mass of people or a mass of objects, we talk about like kind of a big, inanimate, amorphous, indistinguishable thing, that's really big, but you can't like separate the individual parts from the whole, like a big mass of seaweed on the beach. The masses are, a great numbers of people, but they're not individually distinct, at least in this kind of elitist form of thinking. The masses are, represent a great number of people, but it's just this kind of big blob of humanity, just this big amorphous crowd. And elites like Matthew Arnold are worried that they can be whipped into a frenzy, into what we would call like a mob mentality. And culture is their idea of, something that's like kind of a buffer against that. So in the late 19th century, you have the beginnings of, not necessarily the beginnings, but like a real flourishing of institutional forms of creating high culture that is segregated from the mass population. So museums, theaters, universities, opera houses, these are institutions that spatially make a sharp distinction between as it says here, the nobility of art and the vulgarity of mere entertainment. So like, in Boston, the Museum of Fine Arts and the Boston Symphony Orchestra are created in the late 19th century. And it's not a coincidence that this same period in America after the Civil War is one where you see an industrial bourgeoisie, an industrial capitalist ruling class really coming into its own. And its way of demonstrating and reproducing its cultural power is to create these kinds of bourgeois institutions of high culture that are going to be deliberately segregated from the urban masses, even though they are, located in, in cities. There's this, I mentioned a couple of examples, or that we wanted to get into a couple of examples of how high culture and low culture, the distinction between the two of them is like socially arbitrary or socially constructed. And one of them that really demonstrates this is the history of Shakespearean theater. Because at one time, Shakespeare's plays were considered like real popular entertainment for mass audiences. Like in America, you could go and you could see a Shakespearean performance, a play, in like small towns and rural areas of the country. It was not necessarily something that was only the province of an elite. And when you did go to see these Shakespearean performances, it would be more of a kind of circus-like atmosphere in the sense that, you might have jugglers or comedians, like that would be like the warm-up entertainment for the play. And people in the audience might get, drunk and rowdy and throw like food at the actors if they didn't like the actors. So there was this whole kind of like atmosphere where it was more like a kind of a, like a sporting event, rather than the kind of polite, reserved high culture event that we think of when we think of like, Shakespearean plays today that you would see, in a theater or at a university. What happened is that, again, like in the period after the Civil War in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, elites basically started to segregate and take back Shakespeare and redefine it as something that was educational rather than entertaining, right? So they imposed, new rules of etiquette, like, you can't get drunk and throw food at the actors anymore. You can't just like vociferously boo or cheer or, like you can't, you got to be quiet and maybe, clap politely at the end. There was also like more emphasis on reading the plays, which, was to the advantage of the more literate, more, highly educated people, as opposed to, the more commoner mass audiences. So Shakespeare was, basically transformed, as it says here, from popular culture into polite culture, from being something that was entertaining to something that was like, educational and, that you would study, as opposed to something, that was kind of like supposed to be fun. So this really demarcated high culture as something that, again, was distinct and distant from, the masses and low culture, but it was really a pretty arbitrary distinction because it had once been a form of popular entertainment. Similar thing happens with the opera. Just like with Shakespeare's plays, opera was also considered popular entertainment in large parts of the country. It was not uncommon to see operas performed in small towns or, urban enclaves. More like industrial urban neighborhoods. But what happened is that elites again started imposing dress codes and norms of behavior, and now you got to get those little the little white opera gloves. You got to get those little opera glasses, and you got to get dressed up to go to the opera. It also began to insist on more foreign language operas that again privileges the more highly educated and people who'd been to Europe, and it's a more kind of elite activity by the time of this period after the Civil War. Again, it's not a coincidence. The making of high culture, or the making of opera as high culture, kind of comes into fruition along with the rise of this industrial bourgeois capitalist class. Ultimately, though, these high culture elitists are kind of fighting a losing battle, because in the late 19th century and into the early 20th century, mass culture, the thing that they fear as mass culture or mass media, is really becoming an unstoppable force. It's developing alongside the industrialization and urbanization processes of capitalism in the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it's really going to redefine culture as we know it. And we have in the next two slides a kind of a timeline of these events, roughly between the 1880s and the 1920s, where you have, the development of the gramophone that allows popular music to be mass reproduced. And then you have the opening of Nickelodeon parlors that will basically be the predecessors to the first movie theaters. And you have, sensationalistic tabloid-like journalism in the newspapers. So all of these kinds of forms of mass media, whether it's popular music, recording popular recordings for the first time, or the movie industry, or the radio, or tabloid mass journalism. These are all forms of popular entertainment and media that will have a much greater influence than high culture could ever have. That Matthew Arnold could have ever kind of wished for. So this is all going to kind of redefine the landscape of culture in the United States and in other advanced industrialized societies during this period. You have the first radio station founded in 1916, and then the broadcast networks like NBC start to take over and become this mass medium for news and entertainment and discussion of public issues, and of course music as well. And the movie industry continues to grow into the 1920s, and you have the introduction of sound into the movies, which makes movies even more popular from the silent era that had preceded that. You have launchings of things like Reader's Digest that basically kind of distills literature into this really kind of pretty conservative. Reader's Digest always was a pretty reactionary kind of medium. So all of these forms of mass culture are really developing in the late 19th century and early part of the 20th century, especially radio, film, newspapers, and recorded music. And that will prove to be immensely threatening to the next generation of elitists, the defenders of high culture that basically pick up the torch from Matthew Arnold, and try to uphold high culture despite the fact that mass culture is really kind of taking over through these new media technologies. So we look at two books here. The first of them by this extremely unhappy looking guy, F.R. Leavis, is sort of a British elitist in the vein of Matthew Arnold, who, writing in 1930, sounds this book that basically sounds this alarm, saying that high culture is in a state of crisis because of the influence of mass culture, because of the influence of movies and radio and, Reader's Digest and all that kind of thing. And so Arnold, Leavis believed in an ideal definition of culture that would by definition only be available to a minority within the upper classes. But now this minority was in an embattled, hostile environment that was created by mass civilization, by movies and radio, advertising, all of these different cultural forms, and these media technologies that people like Leavis really thought were a threat to the best that had been thought and said. He basically worries that mass culture is kind of bring down everything, bring culture down in terms to a level of mediocrity in which it'll be impossible for the best to separate itself. The other book that comes along in the same year and expresses a similar kind of embattled elitism, a sense that the elites have to defend themselves against the mediocrity of the masses, is this book by a Spanish philosopher, Jose Ortega y Gasset, The Revolt of the Masses, in which he also argues that European culture and civilization is in a crisis as a result of hyper democracy. So he literally thinks there's just the people have too much say, there's just too much democracy. And so, we've got to find some way of preserving the proper elite boundaries. So Ortega y Gasset really is concerned with this, and I think this really comes out in this last quote at the bottom of the slide, where he says, the mass crushes beneath it everything that is different, everything that is excellent, individual, qualified, and select. So it's this just very unabashedly elitist idea that the mass by definition is this force of mediocrity that kind of brings everything down to a state of idiocracy, to a state of just where the basically junk, cultural junk food will be the order of the day. And so it's, Ortega y Gasset is pretty fascist in many ways in his thinking. This is a time, of course, where fascism is a growing force in Spain and will eventually take power in Spain in the Franco regime. And so Ortega y Gasset is kind of, I think in some ways, kind of voicing these concerns, these very elitist, unabashedly elitist concerns with the masses and with mass culture. So, in sum, the way that these people kind of defined mass culture was as this culture that was manufactured for large audiences by way of these media technologies like radio, movies, and television, but also that it was of low quality, that mass culture, by definition, was trivial, tacky, intended to appeal to the lowest common denominator. And the reason for that was because it was standardized, it was formulaic, it was, generic. Every song sounded the same, every movie ended up with the same plot twists, repetitive products that were sold to a passive audience, which the elitist high critics assumed that audience was passive and prone to manipulation. We'll want to challenge that idea as this presentation goes on. But for now, note that, this was basically the assumption behind people like Levis and Ortega y Gasset, and before that Matthew Arnold, which is that, if you put this crappy cultural junk food in front of people, that's what they're going to choose instead of, the best that has been thought and said. And that, audiences are just kind of like prone to manipulation by advertising or by the media and so forth. And so they don't really know like what's good for them. So these, critics of mass culture, these elitist critics of mass culture, really worried that mass culture would result in, widespread conformity, a lack of critical thought, that basically it was just turning people into this big blob of humanity without individual distinct parts. The book that kind of where this whole debate culminates, in America at least, is this book called Mass Culture, the Popular Arts in America, that comes out in 1957. It's an anthology that's basically like kind of a who's who of all kinds of different cultural critics, sociologists, media critics, a whole range of different intellectuals who are basically like sounding off on this question of mass culture and the mass culture debate. So this book basically, you can see kind of like three positions being staked out. And, the first one we've already looked at pretty extensively. The first position that many elitist critics took was to kind of bemoan, to, lament the fact that the majority continue to consume these forms of mass culture that they consider to be inferior compared to high culture. Why it is that people continue to choose cultural junk food, because they can be manipulated, and advertising and media are manipulating them. Then you have on the other side of the debate, like really on the opposite end of the spectrum, are people who are more like the populist defenders of mass culture, who basically say like, what's the big deal? Like, who cares? This is just like kind of harmless entertainment. And yeah, maybe it's not very like good culture, but really, like, what's the problem? And why not just let people choose? If they're going to choose, crappy music and bad movies, then, why not just let them? That was, sort of the more kind of the populist defense of like, just let the people decide, let the people choose. And then I guess like somewhere in between, or, definitely its own kind of position, is this third position among socialist critics who, on the one hand, were, you know, they incorporated a little bit of the elite criticism in the sense that they saw mass culture as a kind of like a form of social control, in which, you know, people were being manipulated. But they also saw it, that the purpose of this manipulation, the function of this manipulation, was to maintain the power of the capitalist class. And this distinguished them from the elitist critics, you know, who were very much siding with the capitalist class. The socialist critics were the ones that, you know, were, you know, had you know, a more of a critique of capitalism and a critique of consumerism, a critique of the power of the capitalist class, and believed that what mass culture was doing was basically reproducing these inequalities and reproducing this lifestyle of consumerism. The term that had been coined, and that we will talk about in future presentations, the term for this that came out of the socialist criticism of mass culture was the culture industry. With the word industry, of course, signaling our attention to the fact that this is a business that is made for profit and that ultimately enriches and empowers a particular capitalist class. This kind of criticism was not something that the elites like Matthew Arnold or Ortega y Gasset or F.R. Leavis were willing to touch. This was something that we'll look at more in connection with the group of scholars known as the Frankfurt School, including Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer. But to kind of encapsulate this whole mass culture debate, one of the most influential essays, one of the most widely read essays from this collection, comes from a guy by the name of Dwight MacDonald. It's really ironic because back in the 1930s, Dwight MacDonald used to edit a socialist newspaper called The Masses, you know, where obviously like the masses had a positive resonance in this way, you know, a positive meaning for, you know, socialists like himself in the 1930s. But in the 1950s, Dwight MacDonald, like a lot of American intellectuals, had become more conservative, had kind of renounced some of his former Marxist beliefs, and now took on this word mass or mass culture or the masses in a much more elitist and pejorative sense. So in his 1957 essay, he writes now about mass culture as suffering from what he calls Gresham's law, where the bad stuff drives out the good because it is more, you know, understood and enjoyed. It's kind of like, I think he thought of it in terms of like junk food. Like if you give people, or especially like kids, the option between like spinach that is good for them and like, you know, a McDonald's hamburger or, you know, candy, they're going to choose the McDonald's hamburger and the candy every time. And so what people like Dwight MacDonald were kind of worried about was that this was going to, again, like lower the standards of popular, of culture. And so the result would be this homogenous culture that threatens to engulf everything in its spreading ooze, that it would just kind of bring everything down with it. However, MacDonald also made this distinction that's going to carry us over into the next section of the presentation here, a distinction between folk culture and mass culture, where he says, you know, basically, unlike mass culture, folk culture is this something that grew from below, in the sense that like it was grassroots or more democratic or more participatory. He says folk art was spontaneous, an expression of the people, pretty much without the benefit of high culture to suit their own needs. And then he then compares this with mass culture. He says mass culture is imposed from above. It is fabricated by technicians hired by businessmen. Its audience are passive consumers. Their participation limited to the choice between buying and not buying. So McDonald has kind of opened up this distinction between mass culture and folk culture that we're going to kind of pry into now by looking at the term folk culture and how it's been defined, again, in these relationships of opposition. So as McDonald is starting to suggest here, folk culture has been something that has been associated or defined as a cultural form that's more organic, something that is created in a more democratic way by the common people, and therefore, from below, in a grassroots kind of way, as McDonald means it. And this is what distinguishes it from mass culture, whereas mass culture also appeals to common people or, lower classes of people. Folk culture is something that is collectively produced and not privately owned or for profit. And so therefore the thing that distinguishes folk culture is this sense of authenticity, the sense that it's, more democratic, it's more participatory, but also that it is in the embodiment of an ideal of simplicity and tradition and community. And so therefore, folk culture always has these kind of like this tinge of nostalgia attached to it, whereby the more society became, an industrialized, urbanized, modern society, the more people kind of looked back to folk culture with a sense of nostalgia, with a sense of what had been lost, with a sense of a more simple pastoral ideal of traditional life in the countryside and a culture that was shared and democratic and not like, privately owned. So in other words, as people kind of become to be more like alienated in a modern capitalist society, they look to folk culture as a kind of an alternative through this prism of nostalgia and a desire to recapture what has been lost in modern industrial urban society. So folk culture, generally as speaking, the term refers to this culture that is created by and for common people. And usually when we talk about folk culture, depending on the particular group or nationality of people, it usually refers to like, maybe a style of music or a style of dance or a style of dress, or stories like folk tales or folklore, folk legends. But the idea being that these are something that are, collectively owned and produced, that this folk culture embodies these values, these traditions, these rituals of a people, and as national, as nation states have kind of come into being as what Benedict Arnold calls imagined communities, folk culture has been, the thing that is, supposed to kind of like represent the culture of a nation, to represent the culture of a people, to represent its symbols, its traditions, its values, and so forth. And again, as societies became more industrialized and urban and modern, the appeal of folk culture continued to grow as, the embodiment of this ideal of simplicity. So in many parts of the world, this takes different forms of, traditional dances, traditional styles of dress, legends and storytelling, arts and crafts, music, and so forth. The idea, again, just being that this bundle of practices, these rituals, these traditions, these symbols of folk culture are meant to represent an ethnic group or even an entire nation of people. Now, a pretty well-known, preeminent kind of example of folk culture would be folk music. Music is, in all of these different folk cultures, music usually plays a central role, no matter like what part of the world we're talking about. But in terms of the folk music scene, say that came about in the early part of the 20th century, it again emphasizes the folk part of the folk music, emphasizes participation, the idea of a participatory culture, and songs that are passed down from one generation to the next, often without a sense of like who originally wrote it or who owns it. It's just a kind of a thing that belongs to the people. And so folk culture and folk music is supposed to be something that's kind of simple, that's accessible, that anybody in theory can play, that anybody in theory can at least like sing along to, people can participate. And in terms of the content of that folk music, it's not always or necessarily political, but it very often has been, whereby the lyrics of folk songs have often been expressed protests against war, against racism, against the exploitation of the working class, of the exploitation of the environment. There has been historically a close connection that we'll explore in the next couple of slides, a close connection between folk music and movements for social change, protest movements, movements of resistance. We can go back all the way into 100 years ago at least, into the history of the labor movement to find this connection between folk music and struggles against racism, struggles for the working class against exploitation. So, going back more than 100 years, the industrial workers of the world were, a really radical labor union that took hold in the United States. Actually, labor union is not exactly the right way to describe them, because they were, kind of even more radically kind of a network of people who took on actions like sabotage and went on strike and did things to sort of actively disrupt the labor process, and to take power out of the hands of the capitalist class and bring it to working people. And so the IWW was a whole movement that included a kind of like a cultural element in which they, among other things, produced like folk songs. In fact, the IWW had a whole song book they called the Little Red Song Book that had all of these, political songs, many of them very satirical, in the sense that they made fun of people in power and or poked fun at all the various ways that working people were being exploited. So among these organizers, who was also a songwriter, was Joe Hill, most famously executed in the state of Utah by the police and the state. But when he was alive, as an organizer, Joe Hill was also a prolific songwriter and wrote songs like "The Preacher and the Slave," that took a satirical look at the way that religion was basically used to keep working class people in their place. The most famous example of this connection between, the labor movement and folk music is this guy pictured here, Woody Guthrie, with the acoustic guitar with the sticker that says "This machine kills fascists." Woody Guthrie, of course, wrote innumerable songs that expressed the condition of working people and bohemians like himself. Many of them, had made the journey, like Guthrie himself, from Oklahoma to California as so-called Okies, and Woody Guthrie chronicled these stories in his so-called Dust Bowl ballads, which sort of shone a light onto the struggles and the oppression and exploitation that was being faced by working people during the Great Depression. And then, in the 1960s, you have a kind of a revival of this form of politicized folk music, where, young people in particular start to embrace folk music in the late 1950s and then into the early 1960s. And folk music becomes, again, a critical part of the civil rights movement, the New Left, the anti-war movement, later on the women's movement. And so you have these figures like Bob Dylan and Joan Baez and Odetta, who played key roles as both singer-songwriters and as activists. Now, Bob Dylan, after about 1965, kind of stopped writing so many directly political songs, what he called finger-pointing songs, and took a more kind of surreal approach to his lyricism. But Joan Baez, Odetta, so many other folks were real permanent fixtures at anti-war demonstrations and at civil rights demonstrations. The music became an integral part of this social movement. So, in summary, the key elements of folk culture from a sociological perspective that we need to be attended to are the ways that it is, embodied authenticity, community, tradition, participation. Also, the way that folk music and folk culture is defined in this relationship of opposition to mass culture, which is thought of as being, artificial, banal, and overly commercial. The appeal of folk culture, and to some extent, I would say folk music as well, can be seen as a kind of a nostalgic reaction to the alienating effects of capitalist society, to the alienating effects of modern technology, to the alienating effects of urban life. Folk culture has an appeal because it seems simpler, more authentic, more traditional, more participatory, more democratic. And as a result of that, it is very often connected with movements for social change. And it has been since the 1960s. I don't mean to imply that this connection stopped in the 1960s, because it did not. But movements for resistance and social change have had, music as this kind of supplementary, supportive cultural element that, gives voice to the struggles that people have been engaged in. Now, finally, we turn to what is, probably the most recent, or at least the least traditional form of culture that we'll look at, which is popular culture. And here our definition contains, includes elements of both mass and folk culture, what we've been calling both mass and folk culture, but should also be understood as being different, as being distinct from those. So popular culture includes the things that we have associated with mass culture, like, the products of commercial media. It includes movies and, now television, or more recently television, and popular music. But it also includes the things that we've associated with folk culture, that being democratic forms of cultural expression and tradition. So popular culture kind of needs to be understood as its own thing, in the sense that it cannot be understood as being organic or authentic in the way that folk culture is. But it's not something that's just kind of imposed by corporations onto, manipulated, duped audiences in the way that is usually associated with mass media either. So hence, again, the need to understand these concepts in relational terms. So like mass culture, popular and culture includes any of these products that is well liked as measured by commercial success, including celebrities or media events, anything that captures the attention of large audiences. However, contrary to the assumptions about mass culture, our definition of popular culture here does not assume that people are simply passive audiences or manipulated consumers. Audiences often interact with popular culture as active participants, for example, in fan fiction or fantasy sports or online forums. So this is a way of pointing our attention also to the fact that, like, new technologies, especially like forms of social media, make it at least more accessible for larger numbers of people to be producers and not just consumers of popular culture. And this is the thing that distinguishes it from the stereotypes about mass culture, is that people, today, more so than ever, are content producers, people who are creating video, music, art, dances on TikTok, film, video, fashion, gaming, you name it. People are not just like watching as spectators and, consuming as shoppers, but also producing as participants. And that is the thing that distinguishes popular culture, is this interaction, this process of interaction that involves the audience as something that not just as, objects, but also as subjects. Now, as far as the difference between popular culture and folk culture, we can say that popular culture and folk culture both include, products that are created by ordinary people. Popular culture is not just simply the things that are created by media and entertainment conglomerates. There are also things that are created by ordinary people that become part of the larger tapestry of meaning and consciousness. And so, as I mentioned in the last slide, popular culture should be understood as a process of interaction, where people are participating and creating as active subjects, particularly in our current moment where new technologies have made it easier and easier for them to do so. However, popular culture is unlike folk culture in the sense that it cannot be evaluated according to the criteria of authenticity. It should not be seen through these nostalgia-tinged glasses. If we look to popular culture for signs of authenticity, or evaluated according to these criteria of authenticity, we are inevitably going to be disappointed, because popular culture is never fully independent or autonomous from the system of commodification or from technology in the way that folk culture is imagined to be. It's just never as pure as folk culture is imagined to be. Popular culture should be understood, therefore, as an embodiment of like contradictions and conflicts, that it has conflicting elements that include both resistance and capitulation, that includes elements of both opposition and co-optation, that includes both these elements of that has some elements of resistance, but also that has elements of reproduction, that reproduces the inequalities in the system. If we are looking at only one side or the other, we're missing it, right? So we can't just sort of glamorize popular culture in this populist way where it's an expression of the people. And we shouldn't romanticize popular culture in this kind of way, but we shouldn't demonize popular culture as just cultural junk food that the masses unthinkingly consume and reproduce. We have to be able to hold both of these possibilities in our minds at the same time in order to do effective cultural analysis. Now, just like with folk culture, the whole term popular culture came into light in the 1960s, and its definition, especially its relationship to art and high culture, came into focus during the 1960s. Because, historically, like mass culture, popular culture had been defined as subordinate to high culture, like the stuff that was inferior to high culture. It was inferior in quality. It didn't have the same capacity to enlighten or cultivate its audience. So, up until the 1960s, there had been this real rigid distinction between high culture and popular culture. And, high culture was sort of defined by this opposition and this separation. But then in the 1950s and 60s, there's this group of artists that begin to challenge these hierarchies and challenge these boundaries by beginning to include different forms of popular culture in their artwork. And this is what became known as the pop art movement. And in the pop art movement, you had like artists who were incorporating like, comic books and junk food and celebrities into their art. But then you also in the 1960s start to see the opposite, the converse of this, where like popular entertainers, like musicians or filmmakers, begin to incorporate artistic elements into their popular, art. Especially rock musicians are, incorporating like what they consider poetic lyrics or rock operas, things that were traditionally associated with high culture are now being incorporated into popular culture, especially into music, but also into films of the 1960s. So you have this blurring of the boundaries that had previously separated high and low, that had separated art and pop. And, people in the 1960s and especially the 70s and 80s began to theorize that this was part of a larger postmodern condition in society. I don't have nearly enough time to explain the condition of postmodernity right now, but perhaps in a subsequent lecture. Here's some examples of the kind of thing we're talking about with popular art and popular culture. So, and like the pop art movement. And so here we have, Richard Hamilton, English artists, just what is it that makes today's homes so different, so appealing in 1956. And you see, all kinds of examples of the way that he is, covertly or overtly incorporated like all these commodities associated with mass culture, associated with, mass consumerism into his art. The strategically placed Tootsie Pop, the can of Spam, what looks like a soap opera on TV, a poster for, young romance, true love. We've got outside, a marquee for the film The Jazz Singer, the first of the talkie movies from 1927. All of these signs in which like basically like Hamilton is commenting on this post-war 1950s lifestyle of mass consumption in which people are, the good life has been defined in terms of material possessions and acquisitions. And you have just all of these mass-produced commodities that are being consumed at a level the world had never seen at that point. So Hamilton is kind of commenting on that at the same time that he's kind of breaking the boundary separating the high culture and the commercial culture of the masses. Perhaps a little more explicitly, even you have like Roy Lichtenstein incorporating, like comic book, basically, like the form of like comic books into his art, and this kind of like melodramatic, thing that we would associate like with soap operas or, like a really kind of low culture of melodrama, like, I don't care. I'd rather sink than call Brad for help. Or, these like, kind of adolescent looking comic books, right? And Lichtenstein, kind of, these have since become very famous pieces of art in the way that, Lichtenstein kind of incorporated them in the early 1960s. Claes Oldenburg, one of my favorite pieces here, the hamburger, of course, like what could be more iconic in terms of representing post-war mass culture than the cheeseburger, the two cheeseburgers with everything. Somehow, just kind of commenting on like this culture where, like McDonald's was like a pretty new thing at the time. Like the idea that you could drive through and get a hamburger and eat it without even like leaving your car, like that just kind of like epitomized this whole post-war consumer lifestyle that Oldenburg is kind of commenting on by taking this kind of commodity and turning it into like an art form and putting it in a museum. Oldenburg did this with all kinds of stuff, all kinds of just banal mass-produced commodities, and blew them up into huge proportions, made them into giant sculptures, did all kinds of things to give them an aesthetic, artistic form that was sort of beyond their existence as mass-produced commodities. Of course, the master of doing this is Andy Warhol, right? Like, speaking of mass-produced commodities, the Campbell's soup can and the Brillo soap pads are probably the iconic images of this pop art movement from the 1960s. Warhol commenting on The Campbell's soup can, again, is this really banal commodity. You find it in any grocery store, the mass production of it, but also the individual differentiation of it. So, beef, asparagus, celery, chicken broth, like kind of commenting on these individual variations within a pattern of mass production, within a larger logic of mass production. And we will see that Warhol commented on that, logic of mass production, not only with regard to these commodities, but also with regard to celebrities. So, Marilyn Monroe gets the same kind of treatment of mass production with individual variation, with a kind of a superficial variations of color. And so, I think Warhol is kind of commenting on how the whole celebrity culture is also, this kind of the extension of this culture of mass production, these technologies, these industries that are churning out these commodities at a rate that the world had never seen before. And among the commodities that they're mass producing are celebrities. So he does the same with Elvis Presley here, basically putting Elvis Presley's face on John Wayne's body, the sort of the iconic figure of the gun-toting, the gun-toting cowboy. Just this kind of iconic representation of masculinity in the 1950s. So I think Warhol is kind of commenting on these as being mass-produced commodities just as much as a Campbell's soup can. The image of tough guy masculinity is, a commodity in the same way that a Brillo box is. And as I mentioned too, you have things going in the opposite direction here, where like a group like the Beatles, the Beatles were really at the forefront of this movement of beginning to demand that they be seen not just as like popular musicians, but as artists, right? That the Beatles wanted to be taken seriously as doing something, more than like writing nice songs that you could dance to about, I want to hold your hand and that kind of thing. By 1967, with this album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band, the Beatles are kind of, aspiring to be evaluated according to the same kind of aesthetic criteria that artists would be aspiring to be evaluated according to. So like John Lennon comes out, for example, in the previous year with his own book of poetry. He wants to be taken seriously as a poet and not just as like somebody who writes songs. This album cover here that's designed by Peter Blake is also, sort of a commentary on, sort of like melding high culture and popular culture together. You see a number of celebrities back here. There's, Bob Dylan, there's Karl Marx, there's, the young Beatles, movie stars, kings, queens, philosophers. Everybody gets kind of mixed up here. So there's a blurring of boundaries and also an aspiration for popular music and popular culture to be taken seriously as art. Similar kinds of things are going on in the movie industry in the late 60s and the 1970s. You have a lot of directors who want to be taken seriously as like kind of auteur creators, and that, films should be, not movies, but films should be evaluated in the same way according to like kind of aesthetic artistic criteria. So what this whole movement of the 1960s signaled was that popular culture was being taken more seriously as an art form, that these old hierarchies that had separated high art from popular culture were breaking down into this new moment of a postmodern culture. So you had, artists incorporating forms of popular culture on the one hand, and pop musicians and filmmakers incorporating artistic cultural content with aesthetic qualities on the other hand. Now, finally, just to end this, we don't have a time to this. The so-called Birmingham School requires a lecture kind of its own, but for now, we can begin to see the origins of what came to be known as cultural studies as kind of emerging out of this moment in the 1960s and 70s. So the Contemporary Center for Cultural Studies was basically this group of scholars and researchers at the university in Birmingham, England. And so it became known as the Birmingham School. And during the 1960s and 70s, they were utilizing sort of Marxist theory, particularly Antonio Gramsci's concept of hegemony, to theorize the role of popular culture in social struggles and in what I previously talked about, this like dialectic of resistance and reproduction. So a more simple way of putting this is that they wanted to understand the role of culture in securing popular consent. What Gramsci had said, that hegemony was the ability to win the consent of the masses, the spontaneous consent of the masses, so that people who were oppressed and exploited would just willingly go along with the system. They would consent to going along with the way things are if hegemony was successful, and that would maintain ruling class power. So, the Birmingham School says, yeah, well, that's one of the things that basically popular culture does, is it secures the consent of the masses. It basically gets people to go along with capitalism and consumerism and this whole system of exploitation. However, they also say that this hegemony is never automatically achieved, that hegemony is like hard work, and the ruling class never fully has its handle on the masses. It's always subject to resistance from the subordinate classes. And so therefore, popular culture, to paraphrase Gramsci, are the trenches in a war of position for cultural hegemony. Gramsci, had lived through World War I, and he used a lot of like war metaphors to describe class struggle and political mobilization. And so one of the things he had talked about was that culture was part of this war of position, and a war of position was a long-term struggle to change people's hearts and minds, to change people's consciousness, so that a revolutionary society could kind of be created in embryo within the existing society. And within that culture, that war of position, culture were the trenches. I mean, this was like where the war of position was being fought. The war over ideas, over values, over culture. Basically, Gramsci is saying that any revolutionary must strive to change the culture, the values, the meanings, the dominant understanding, to change people's consciousness. That is something that must be achieved. However, that is a very long-term, protracted, and difficult war. And so popular culture was sort of, in Gramsci's terms, was, kind of like the trenches where this long-term protracted war was being fought out. So the Birmingham School, come along, Gramsci is writing like in the 1920s and 30s, the Birmingham School are writing in the 1960s and 70s. And so they're like, okay, well, where do we see the trenches of cultural warfare today? And basically the Birmingham School found that cultural struggle was very much alive in among young people and among what they called subcultures. And so these would be, groups of young people in the 60s and 70s, like, the hippies, the mods, punks, skinheads, Rastafarians, and so forth. And the Birmingham School theorists identified these subcultures of young people as sources or potential sources, at least, of resistance. Where resistance was being carried out, not necessarily by marching and demonstrating and making demands on the government, but that resistance was being carried out in a more kind of like symbolic, cultural kind of way, through the way that people dressed, through their style, through their music, through these larger kind of symbolic forms. So in the 1970s, authors from the Birmingham School began to look at these different subcultures. They find, that there are these elements of resistance. There are also these elements of co-optation where, subcultural style is commercialized and commodified and turned back into mass culture. So again, it's an ongoing cultural struggle. They don't necessarily like glamorize or romanticize subcultures as sources of resistance, because they are subject to commercialization and co-optation. But they do take them very seriously as signs of resistance, of signs of like the alienation of young people, and the way that young people were trying to express that alienation and their resistance toward alienation through symbolic forms. Stuart Hall was among the people who, Stuart Hall was actually like sort of like the head of the Contemporary Center for Cultural Studies, the Birmingham School, and a very important theorist, especially when it came to these questions of youth culture in the 1960s. And then later on, he did a lot to sort of adapt Gramsci's ideas towards this idea of studying popular culture. And here he has a quote that I just kind of want us to leave it with, because I think that this says so much about the way we've been trying to set up what the study of culture should try to do. So he describes popular culture as a constant battlefield, where on the one hand, dominant representations serve to reproduce social inequality. They serve to reproduce ruling class power. But on the other hand, there are also these instances of resistance among subordinated groups. And Hall says this is the dialectic of cultural struggle. In our times, it goes on continuously in the complex lines of resistance and acceptance, refusal and capitulation, which make the field of culture a sort of constant battlefield. And so that's what we must do as sociologists studying this field of culture, these trenches of culture, is to keep in mind both these elements of resistance and acceptance, of refusal and capitulation, rather than only seeing one or the other, as is very common. So that'll be the place where we kind of proceed from there. And I will leave it at that. So thank you very much. See you next time. Bye.